The day was supposed to be one of solemn remembrance, a day when the entire nation gathered its breath and lowered its head in silence to honor a man who had devoted his life to service. General Marcus Ellison was no ordinary figure in the military. Decorated countless times, respected across ranks, and deeply admired in civilian life as well. He represented something rare in modern times: integrity, discipline, and dignity, wrapped in one human being. His funeral was not simply a family event. It was a matter of national honor. From senators to state governors, from retired military brass to local community leaders, people poured into the cathedral that morning, each carrying the weight of respect on their shoulders. Flags lined the avenue, a military band prepared their instruments, and the air, though heavy with grief, carried a certain stillness, the kind that wraps around moments of deep reverence. No one could have predicted that, within hours, the story would no longer be about honoring a fallen hero, but about an act so brazen, so reckless, and so poisoned by racism that it would shake the entire country to its core. The cathedral stood, tall, its stained glass windows glowing as beams of morning sun slipped through, painting colorful streaks across the wooden pews. Veterans, many with medals pinned proudly to their jackets, lined up side by side, some standing stiff, as if still, in formation, others letting silent tears trace their cheeks. The Ellison family sat in the front row, their grief visible, yet carried with quiet strength. Dignitaries whispered prayers, and civilians who had traveled from faraway states filled every corner of the massive space. Cameras, respectfully distant, captured the solemn proceedings, ensuring that history recorded the farewell of a man who had represented the very best of the armed forces. At the center, draped in the flag of the United States, lay the casket of General Ellison, polished, dignified, carried earlier by pallbearers in crisp uniforms who moved with clockwork precision. It was during the hymn that the atmosphere began to shift. The hymn, a slow and haunting rendition of Abide With Me, filled the hall with a collective sorrow. People closed their eyes, letting the music guide their mourning. That was when a murmur spread from the back, a sound so out of place it felt like a jarring crack against the sacred silence. At first, people thought it was just someone adjusting, or perhaps a microphone catching static. But when heads began to turn, when gasps erupted from the back pews, it became clear that this was no ordinary disruption. A uniformed officer, later identified as Sergeant David Ross, a mid-ranking police officer with a record that was more checkered than most realized at the time, had stood up, not with reverence, but with a weapon in his hand, a gun, black and menacing, pointed directly toward the front, where the nation's highest-ranking military officials sat. The gasp turned into panic, but not the kind of chaos one sees in everyday disturbances. This was different. Military personnel reacted instantly, their training hardwired into every movement. Secret Service agents, who were present because of attending dignitaries, lunged from the sides, their hands instinctively moving toward their holsters. But the most chilling sight of all was not the weapon itself, but where it was aimed. Sergeant Ross, his face twisted with hostility, had leveled his firearm at General Ellison's successor, General Anthony Whitaker, a black man, decorated in his own right, and the man chosen to continue Ellison's legacy. In that single instant, the funeral transformed from a house of mourning into a battleground of hate. A racist cop, in full view of mourners, had chosen the sacred moment of a hero's farewell to deliver a message that was not only personal, but poisonous to the core of national unity. Witnesses would later testify that Ross's words, though partly drowned in the eruption of noise, were sharp enough to cut through the commotion. He spat racial slurs, vile words that echoed through the high arches of the cathedral. He accused General Whitaker of being unworthy, of staining the uniform, and shouted about how the country was being handed over to the wrong kind of men. Each word was dripping with prejudice, a venom that felt ancient yet alive, and in the silence of that sacred space, the ugliness of racism was laid bare in its rawest form. People ducked, some screamed, some froze, while others rushed to shield the family of General Ellison. The organ fell silent mid-note, leaving the sound of Ross's rage suspended in the air like smoke. But here's where the story took its first unexpected turn. Unlike many incidents where such violence ends in tragedy before anyone can intervene, this one collided with the presence of trained professionals who were not only armed but prepared. Before Ross could take another step forward, before he could even squeeze the trigger, General Whitaker himself had risen from his seat. Calm, steady, and composed, he stared directly into the face of the man threatening him. Those who were present that day would describe it as a moment frozen in time, the calm dignity of a man who had faced combat zones across the world, standing unflinching before the pointed barrel of hate. Whitaker's voice carried across the hall, commanding but not shaken. "Put the weapon down, Sergeant. You disgrace the badge you wear." Those words, echoing in the cathedral, became the pivot of the entire event. Ross hesitated, his hands shaking, his lips curling with rage, but even he seemed momentarily struck by the authority in Whitaker's tone. That hesitation was all it took. Secret Service agents tackled him from the side, forcing his arm upward just as his finger twitched on the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the stained glass calm, a single, deafening blast that ricocheted through the hall. The bullet buried itself harmlessly into the high ceiling, showering down fragments of plaster and glass, but sparing lives. In seconds, Ross was wrestled to the ground, disarmed, and pinned beneath a swarm of bodies trained to neutralize threats with precision. The congregation, shaken and terrified, slowly realized the danger had passed. Mothers clutched children, veterans clenched fists, and the Ellison family, though rattled, remained unharmed. General Whitaker, who had not moved a single step backward during the ordeal, placed a steadying hand on the shoulder of a young officer who was trembling from the shock. "Stand tall," he said softly, embodying the very strength that had made him a leader. The scene that followed was chaotic. Police cars surrounding the cathedral, emergency units rushing in, and reporters who had been covering the funeral now scrambling to cover a story that had turned into a national spectacle. What was supposed to be a day of mourning had become the front page of every newspaper and the lead story on every network by evening. Yet, as shocking as the event itself was, what followed in the weeks and months afterward would become even more astonishing. Because for the first time in recent memory, an officer of the law, one shielded so often by the excuses of split-second decisions or misunderstood intentions, was not only arrested but charged with attempted murder, terrorism, and hate crimes. And more shocking still, he would be sentenced, not to a few years behind bars or some negotiated plea deal, but to life in prison. A racist cop, caught on one of the most public stages imaginable, had finally faced the full weight of justice. The story of how that happened, of the investigation, the trial, the testimonies, and the unprecedented sentence, is a journey that reveals the cracks in the system, the courage of those who refused to stay silent, and the turning point that forced a nation to confront its demons in the most public way possible. And so, while General Ellison's funeral was meant to be the closing chapter of one man's extraordinary life, it instead became the opening chapter of a different story, one of accountability, of justice, and of a society deciding it could no longer excuse the poison of hate. In the days following the attempted shooting, the nation was consumed by a single question: who was Sergeant David Ross? And how could a man entrusted with a badge turn a moment of national mourning into a spectacle of hate? At first, details were scarce. Officials released only the basics: his name, rank, and that he had been taken into custody pending charges. But in the era of instant media, silence never lasts long. Within hours, journalists began digging. Old reports surfaced, past complaints, once buried under bureaucratic paperwork, came to light. And the portrait that emerged of Ross was not one of a lone, troubled man who suddenly snapped, but of a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Ross had been on the police force for nearly 12 years, stationed in a mid-sized city precinct that was no stranger to controversy. Colleagues described him as hot-tempered, combative, and deeply distrustful of anyone who didn't look or think like him. Some even whispered that he had openly voiced racist opinions during roll calls or casual conversations, but these were often brushed aside as just his way. Internal affairs records, once shielded from public view, revealed that Ross had been the subject of at least 6 citizen complaints over the years. Excessive force, racially charged language, intimidation, tactics. Each complaint had been investigated, but almost all ended with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. In reality, the system that was supposed to hold him accountable had done little more than protect him. The more reporters dug, the uglier it became. In one incident, Ross had pulled over a black teenager for a broken taillight. The teen claimed Ross pointed his gun at him during the stop, calling him a thug and accusing him of planning something. No charges were filed. In another, Ross had arrested a Hispanic man outside a grocery store after accusing him of loitering. Witnesses alleged Ross slammed the man against the hood of the car, muttering slurs under his breath. Again, the case quietly disappeared into the files. What stood out was not just the frequency of these incidents, but how they had failed to stop him from wearing the uniform, carrying a gun, and patrolling the streets. Every complaint, every red flag, had been an opportunity to intervene, and every time, the system had chosen silence when footage from the funeral incident was broadcast. However, there was no silencing what millions had already seen with their own eyes. The image of Ross, weapon raised, screaming slurs at a black general in front of the nation's elite, could not be brushed aside as a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. The excuse of split-second decision-making held no water here. He hadn't been under threat. He hadn't been responding to an emergency. He had chosen that moment, at that funeral, to reveal the depths of his prejudice. And the country was watching. Public outrage spread like wildfire. Protests erupted outside Ross's precinct within 24 hours. Veterans marched side by side with civil rights activists, carrying signs that read, "Honor Ellison, Protect Whitaker," "End Racism," in uniform. Social media exploded with hashtags, millions of voices demanding that this time, justice be done. For once, it wasn't just activists calling for accountability. Conservative commentators, military families, and even some of Ross's fellow officers publicly denounced his actions. The overwhelming consensus was clear. Ross had disgraced not only the badge, but the very institution he swore to protect. The funeral incident had crossed every imaginable line. Behind the scenes, federal investigators moved quickly, because dignity had been present. The Secret Service and the Department of Justice were directly involved. Ross was not simply facing local charges. He was being investigated for attempted assassination, terrorism, and hate crimes, charges that carried severe penalties. Federal prosecutors built their case meticulously, combing through Ross's history, his online activity, his past complaints, and even his financial records. What they uncovered painted a chilling picture. Ross had ties to extremist forums online, where he frequently posted under pseudonyms, ranting about race, power, and how the country was falling apart. Some of these posts even hinted at his desire to make a statement someday, to show them what happens when real men stand up. Suddenly, the funeral incident no longer looked like a spontaneous outburst. It looked premeditated. The turning point came when investigators accessed Ross's home computer. Hidden in a folder buried deep within his hard drive were documents, not only racist manifestos he had written, but also disturbing notes about General Whitaker. It appeared Ross had tracked Whitaker's career for months, obsessing over his rise through the ranks. He wrote about how Whitaker didn't deserve the uniform, how men like him should never command true Americans. Even more chilling were drafts of what appeared to be plans, including dates, places, and possible scenarios, where he could confront Whitaker publicly. The funeral, in many ways, was the culmination of Ross's hate-fueled obsession. He had waited for the perfect stage, the perfect audience, to unleash his message of venom. When this information reached the public, the outrage only deepened. People were no longer just angry at Ross, they were angry at the institutions that had allowed him to carry a badge for over a decade, despite glaring warning signs. They were angry at the repeated failures of accountability, the system that had dismissed complaints, and the culture that had tolerated his behavior until it escalated to near. The media coined a phrase that echoed in every headline: the cop who should never have been a cop. Editorials demanded sweeping reforms. Lawmakers introduced emergency hearings on police oversight, and for once, it felt as though the cries for change could not be ignored. But amidst the chaos, one figure stood out above all: General Anthony Whitaker. Instead of retreating from the public eye, Whitaker chose to step forward. Just days after the funeral, he addressed the nation from the steps of the very cathedral where the incident had taken place. Dressed in uniform, his voice steady, he delivered words that resonated far beyond the military. We cannot let hate define our service. We cannot allow prejudice to wear the uniform of protection. What happened here was not just an attack on me. It was an attack on every value this country claims to stand for, and we must answer it, not with more hate, but with justice, with accountability, and with courage. The speech was replayed across every network, quoted in newspapers, and shared millions of times online. Too many. Whitaker had not only survived an attempt on his life, but had emerged as a symbol of resilience and dignity in the face of hate. Meanwhile, Ross sat in federal custody, his every movement monitored, his once confident demeanor reportedly collapsing under the weight of the charges against him. For a man who had spent years projecting power through his badge and gun, the reality of being stripped of both was a humiliation he had never prepared for. But the nation was preparing for something else: the trial. And as prosecutors assembled their case, it became clear that this would not be a quiet, procedural matter. It would be one of the most watched trials of the decade, a test not only of Ross's guilt, but of the country's willingness to hold one of its own accountable, when the crime was rooted in racism. And so, the stage was set. A disgraced officer, with a trail of unchecked misconduct, a general who had become the face of resilience, and a public unwilling to accept excuses. What began as a funeral had become a courtroom battle that would decide not just the fate of one man, but the message a nation sent to every office. When the trial of Sergeant David Ross finally began, the nation held its breath. By then, months had passed since the funeral incident, but the memory was still raw, etched into the minds of millions who had watched the horrifying footage replay again and again on every screen. The courthouse itself became a fortress, with barricades erected around the perimeter, crowds of protesters and supporters pressed against them, and a swarm of cameras capturing every angle. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another trial of a police officer. This was a trial that symbolized everything people had been demanding for years: accountability, transparency, and justice that could not be bargained away. The courtroom filled quickly each morning, with reporters, activists, and veterans sitting, shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the man who had once carried a badge but now wore an orange jumpsuit. Ross sat at the defense table, his posture stiff, his expression alternating between defiance and weariness. He had once carried himself with the swagger of authority, but here, stripped of his uniform and surrounded by marshals, he looked smaller, diminished. Across the aisle, prosecutors assembled stacks of files, videos, and witness lists so extensive that the judge had ordered extra storage in chambers just to hold them all. Leading the charge was federal prosecutor Linda Chavez, a woman known for her sharp instincts and relentless pursuit of justice. She had prosecuted organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and high-profile hate crime cases. But even she admitted to colleagues that this trial carried a weight unlike any other. From the very first statement, the prosecution set the tone. Chavez rose, her voice steady and deliberate, and addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about a split-second mistake. It is not about confusion in the line of duty. This case is about hate. It is about a man entrusted with a badge who chose to weaponize that badge against the very values it is meant to uphold. And it is about ensuring that no officer, no matter his rank, no matter his uniform, is above accountability when he betrays the trust of the people." Her words struck like a hammer, and the jury leaned in. The defense, meanwhile, scrambled to paint a different picture. Ross's attorney, a well-known figure named Michael Hanlon, attempted to frame his client as a man under stress, overwhelmed by years of service, pushed to a breaking point by personal struggles. But from the outset, it was clear the jury wasn't buying it. Stress does not explain racial slurs. Stress does not explain targeting a general at a funeral. Stress does not explain a folder of hateful manifestos tucked away on a computer. The witnesses began to take the stand, and one by one, the image of Ross grew darker. First came the veterans who had been present that day, men and women who had served alongside General Ellison and now bore the trauma of nearly witnessing another general gunned down before their eyes. One veteran, his voice cracking, recalled the moment Ross raised his weapon. "I thought I was about to watch history's ugliest moment play out in front of me. I thought I was going to see a man assassinated for the color of his skin." Another spoke of shielding children in the pews, terrified they would not survive the chaos. Each testimony added weight to the charge of attempted murder, but even more so, to the charge of terrorism. Ross hadn't just threatened a man, he had threatened an entire community in one symbolic act of hate. Then came General Anthony Whitaker himself. The courtroom fell into a hush as he walked to the stand, his uniform immaculate, his posture as disciplined as ever. He took the oath and settled into the chair with the same calm presence that had stunned Ross in the cathedral that day. When asked what he remembered most, Whitaker's answer was simple yet piercing. "I remember the hate in his eyes. I've seen enemies in combat zones, men who wanted me dead because of the uniform I wore. But this was different. This was a man in my own country, wearing a badge that was supposed to mean protection. And he looked at me not as a fellow citizen, not even as a fellow human being, but as a target. That is a betrayal no training prepares. You four." His words carried through the courtroom like a thunderclap, leaving jurors visibly shaken, some even dabbing at tears. For many, it was the defining moment of the trial, the clear, dignified voice of the man who had faced the gun and refused to bow. But the prosecution didn't stop at emotional testimony. They dug into the hard evidence. Forensic experts confirmed that Ross's gun had been loaded with hollow-point bullets, rounds designed to cause maximum damage. Digital forensic analysts presented Ross's online activity, displaying his hateful posts on extremist forums for the jury to see. The words were vile, unmistakable, and damning. One post, just weeks before the funeral, read, "When the day comes, the country will know that men like Whitaker don't belong in command." Another, "A funeral is the perfect place to show what happens when symbols of weakness take over strength." Each post was projected onto a screen for the jury, the defense squirming as they tried to object, but the judge overruling. Ross's own words were now his undoing. The defense attempted to counter with their own witnesses. Former colleagues of Ross testified that he was under pressure, that he had always been a bit outspoken but never dangerous. Hanlon tried to argue that the manifestos found on Ross's computer were just rants, expressions of frustration not meant to be taken literally. but every attempt fell flat. The prosecution reminded the jury that a man does not aim a loaded gun at a general during a funeral, if he does not intend to act on his words. Ross's past complaints, the ones once buried, were also introduced into evidence. Victims testified about being harassed, intimidated, and degraded by Ross in ways eerily similar to what Whitaker had faced. The pattern was undeniable. Ross himself eventually took the stand, against his attorney's advice. It was a gamble meant to humanize him, but it backfired catastrophically. Instead of remorse, Ross offered excuses. He claimed he had been provoked by Whitaker's arrogance. He rambled about how the military was being destroyed from the inside. He even slipped into using racially charged language again, trying to mask it as slang, but only reinforcing the prosecution's argument. At one point, when pressed about why he had aimed at Whitaker specifically, Ross muttered, "Because men like him don't deserve the rank." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and even his own attorney buried his face in his hands. In that moment, Ross had all but convicted himself. By the time closing arguments arrived, the verdict seemed inevitable. Prosecutor Chavez stood before the jury one last time and reminded them, "This case is about choice." Sergeant Ross chose to bring a loaded gun into a funeral. He chose to aim it at a general because of the color of his skin. He chose to write words of hate and plot acts of violence. Now, you must choose whether this nation tolerates hate behind a badge, or whether we say enough. Her voice rang with finality. The defense's closing was subdued, an attempt to beg for leniency, to suggest Ross was a broken man who needed help, not life behind bars. But the jury's faces told the story. They had already made up their minds. After weeks of testimony, after mountains of evidence, and countless hours of deliberation, the jury filed back into the room. The judge asked for their decision. The foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand, and read the words the country had been waiting to hear. Guilty on all counts. Attempted murder, terrorism, hate crimes, conspiracy, every charge. Stuck, Ross slumped in his chair, his once defiant posture collapsing entirely. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos this time, but in a collective exhale, a wave of relief and vindication. Families embraced, veterans saluted, activists wept openly, and General Whitaker, seated quietly, bowed his head in solemn respect, not for Ross's fate, but for the justice that had finally been delivered. The sentencing phase was next, and the nation braced itself. The trial may have ended with a guilty verdict, but for many, the true weight of justice would only be measured in the sentencing. What punishment would the court hand down to a man who had disgraced his badge, threatened a decorated general, and turned a national hero's funeral into a near? The courthouse filled once again, as if the nation itself could not look away. People camped outside overnight, just to secure a spot inside the gallery. Veterans in uniform, activists holding photographs of past victims of hate, families clutching small American flags. They all converged to witness what would happen next. When Ross was brought into the courtroom that morning, he appeared a shadow of the man who once raised his gun with such arrogance. His orange jumpsuit hung loosely, his hands cuffed, his eyes darting nervously. Yet even now, there was no sign of remorse. If anything, there was a defiant tightness in his jaw, as though he still clung to some twisted belief that he had been right all along. The tension was palpable. At the front of the courtroom sat General Whitaker, calm and composed, alongside members of General Ellison's family, who had requested to be present. For them, this was not just about punishment, it was about closure. The judge, an experienced federal jurist named Harold Mitchell, entered the room with the gravitas of a man who understood the magnitude of the moment. He had presided over terrorism cases, corruption scandals, and organized crime trials, but he later admitted privately that this case carried an emotional weight, unlike anything else in his career. He began by allowing victim impact statements, a chance for those directly affected to speak before sentencing. The first to speak was General Ellison's widow, dressed in black. Her voice quivered, but never broke, as she turned toward Ross. "My husband devoted his life to service, to protecting the freedoms of people like you, Sergeant Ross. On the day we laid him to rest, you tried to turn his farewell into a spectacle of hate. You dishonored not just him, but every person who ever wore the uniform. I cannot forgive you, but I pray someday this country heals from what you did." Her words hung heavy in the air. Next came a young officer who had been in the cathedral that day, tasked with security. He recalled, trembling as Ross raised his weapon, frozen between duty and terror. "I thought I failed that day. I thought I failed my general, my country, and the people I swore to protect. But looking at you now, I realize the failure wasn't mine, it was yours. You failed the badge, you failed the oath, and you failed humanity." His voice cracked, and jurors who had returned for the sentencing wiped tears from their eyes. Finally, General Whitaker himself stood. His words were steady, each syllable deliberate. "Sergeant Ross, you aimed your weapon at me not because I wronged you, but because of the color of my skin. You did it because hate consumed you. And in doing so, you aimed that weapon at every man and woman who has ever been judged, not by their service, but by their appearance. I survived that day, but this country cannot survive if men like you are allowed to wear the badge unchecked. Justice must speak louder than hate." When the statements concluded, Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his expression grave. He addressed Ross directly. "Sergeant David Ross, you were given the highest responsibility a civilian officer can hold, the authority to enforce the law and protect your community. Instead, you betrayed that trust in the most despicable way imaginable. You plotted, you prepared, and you attempted to carry out an act of violence motivated purely by racism and hate. Your actions not only endangered lives, but struck at the heart of what this nation claims to stand for. And you did it in a place meant for mourning, at the funeral of a man whose legacy you are not worthy to utter." Ross shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, his eyes flashing with something between resentment and pride. The judge continued, his voice rising, "I have presided over many cases, but rarely have I encountered such a blatant and unrepentant betrayal of the badge. This court has no tolerance for terrorism, for racism, or for those who hide behind authority to commit crimes. You are hereby sentenced to life in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." The words reverberated through the courtroom. Gasps erupted, followed by tears, embraces, and quiet sobs of relief. Outside, crowds that had been holding their breath for hours exploded into cheers when the news reached them. Some dropped to their knees in gratitude, others chanted in unison, "Justice served! Justice served!" It was a scene unlike any sentencing in recent memory, not just relief, but a sense of history being made. But inside the courtroom, Ross broke his silence. For the first time since his conviction, he spoke not to apologize, not to repent, but to spew more venom. "This is a sham. You're all blind. I was right about Whitaker, and one day, you'll see it. You can lock me up, but you can't silence the truth." His words caused an uproar, marshals rushing to restrain him as the judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. But his outburst only underscored what the prosecution had argued all along. Ross had no remorse, no capacity for reflection. His hate was unyielding, and life behind bars was the only answer. The image of Ross being dragged from the courtroom, still shouting slurs as chains clinked around his wrists, became one of the defining images of the case. For millions watching on live television, it was a chilling but satisfying conclusion. The man who had once brandished a gun at a general was now powerless, his voice drowned out by the sound of justice. In the aftermath, reactions poured in from across the country. The president issued a statement praising the verdict as a reminder that hate has no place in uniform. Veterans groups released open letters applauding the decision as a defense of military honor. Civil rights organizations declared it a victory, not just for General Whitaker, but for every community that had suffered under unchecked police misconduct. Even international media covered the story, with headlines in Europe and Asia describing it as a landmark case in American justice. But beyond the celebration, there was reflection. Commentators asked hard questions about how Ross had been allowed to remain on the force for so long, despite his record. Congressional hearings were called to address systemic failures in police oversight. State legislatures proposed new laws to track and discipline officers with repeated complaints. For once, change felt possible, not because of political speeches, but because of the undeniable, inescapable evidence of what happens when hate goes unchecked. For General Whitaker, the sentencing marked both an end and a beginning. In interviews afterward, he said, "I don't celebrate the downfall of any man, but I do celebrate the rise of accountability. Ross will spend the rest of his life behind bars. My hope is that his story serves as a warning, so no family, no community, has to endure what we did that day." His words, as always, carried dignity, a stark contrast to the venom of the man who had tried to kill him. And so, with the clang of a gavel and the weight of a sentence, the chapter of Ross's trial came to a close. A racist cop, once shielded by silence, was now condemned by justice to spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. It was a verdict that reverberated far beyond the walls of that courthouse, a message written not in ink, but in the unmistakable voice of a nation. Life in prison is often romanticized in movies as a place of constant chaos and drama, but for Sergeant David Ross, it became something else entirely: obscurity. Once he had been a man with a badge, someone who commanded fear and respect in his precinct, who strutted through the streets as if untouchable. But in prison, he was just another inmate. The orange jumpsuit stripped away any illusion of authority. The title sergeant meant nothing here. Among the prisoners, he was neither respected nor feared. He was despised. Word of his crimes had traveled quickly, and inmates, many of whom had lived lives shaped by the same racial bias Ross had once embodied, viewed him with a special brand of contempt. Ross learned early that there would be no sympathy for him behind those walls. Inmates whispered as he passed, muttered slurs of their own, and sometimes hurled food in the cafeteria. Guards, though professional, offered him no courtesy beyond procedure. To them, he was just another number in the system, except with the added infamy of being the cop who pointed a gun at a general in front of the entire nation. The irony was suffocating. The badge that had shielded him for 12 years outside now became a liability inside. The very title of cop turned him into prey in a place where authority was meaningless. Yet Ross did not soften. In letters intercepted by prison officials, he continued to write screeds about corruption and betrayal. He clung stubbornly to his narrative that he had been the victim of a conspiracy, that Whitaker had somehow orchestrated his downfall. He called the trial a political show and described himself as a martyr for the truth. The hate that had driven him into the cathedral had not burned out. It had merely been confined to 4 concrete walls. Occasionally, his letters leaked to the outside world, posted in extremist corners of the internet, but each time, they were drowned out by the overwhelming response of the public. Rejection, where once such rhetoric might have found louder echoes. Now Ross's words were little more than static in the wind. His name no longer carried power. His face no longer commanded headlines. He was not a symbol of strength, but a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the world outside prison was changing. The case had forced uncomfortable conversations into the spotlight. Congressional hearings televised across the nation examined how Ross had been allowed to remain on the force despite repeated complaints. Testimony revealed loopholes in accountability systems, police unions shielding bad officers, and departments that prioritized image over integrity. Viewers watched in shock as whistleblowers explained how misconduct files were often buried, how problem officers were quietly shuffled between precincts rather than disciplined, Ross became the face of that broken system, the name cited again and again as proof that reforms were overdue in state houses and city councils. New policies began to take shape. Some states introduced mandatory public databases of officer misconduct, ensuring that no complaint could be quietly buried again. Others passed laws requiring psychological evaluations for officers every few years, particularly for those with multiple complaints. Federal oversight committees gained more teeth, and funding was tied to departments' willingness to cooperate. Critics argued that change was slow, uneven, and still resisted in many quarters, but few could deny that. Ross's case had lit a fire that could not be easily extinguished. For communities long scarred by police misconduct, the sentencing was more than just one man's punishment. It was validation. People who had spent years being told their stories didn't matter, who had watched body cam footage dismissed or seen cases vanish into bureaucracy, now had proof that the system could be forced to act. At vigils and rallies, the chant "Justice for Whitaker, Justice for All" became common. Murals were painted, not of Ross, but of Whitaker standing tall at the cathedral, a symbol of dignity in the face of hate. His calm defiance in that split second when Ross raised the gun had been seared into the national consciousness, becoming a visual reminder that courage does not flinch, even under the barrel of a weapon. The military, too, responded. General Whitaker, already a respected leader, found his voice amplified beyond the ranks. He became an outspoken advocate for bridging divides between civilians and the armed forces, emphasizing values of unity, honor, and equality. At graduations and ceremonies, his speeches drew standing ovations. When asked why he spoke so openly, he said simply, "Because silence allows hate to grow, and I will not be silent." Veterans groups rallied behind him, and his story became required reading in leadership courses across military academies. But perhaps the most profound change came not from laws or policies, but from conversations at kitchen tables, in classrooms, and in community halls. Parents explained to their children why the Ross case mattered, why accountability was necessary, why hate had to be confronted, not ignored. Teachers used it as a case study in ethics and civics. Community leaders cited it as proof that collective voices, protests, petitions, and relentless pressure could bend the arc of justice, even if slowly, in neighborhoods that had long felt invisible. The Ross case became a story of visibility, of being heard, of being seen, and yet, for all the progress, the story was not painted in naive optimism. Skeptics pointed out that Ross was only held accountable because his crime had been so public, so undeniable, so thoroughly documented. They asked, what about the officers whose crimes don't happen on camera, whose victims don't survive, whose cases don't capture national headlines? It was a fair question, and one that lingered. Ross's life sentence was a milestone, but it was also a reminder of how far the road to true accountability still stretched. Months later, on the anniversary of General Ellison's funeral, the cathedral filled once again. This time, there were no guns raised, no chaos. Instead, there was music, reflection, and remembrance. General Whitaker spoke briefly, honoring his predecessor's legacy, and without mentioning Ross by name, he reminded the nation of the lesson. One man's hate nearly overshadowed this sacred day, but it did not. Hate lost. Justice prevailed, and Ellison's legacy remains untarnished. The crowd rose in applause, and for a moment, it felt as if the wound of that day had begun to heal. Inside prison, Ross remained what he had become, a forgotten figure. His appeals were denied, his name slowly fading from the headlines, while he had once imagined himself a soldier in some imagined war. He ended his days in obscurity. His legacy defined not by his rank or his years of service, but by the chains on his wrists and the hate in his heart. To the world outside, he was not a martyr, not a hero, not even a cautionary tale anymore. He was just gone, swallowed by the walls of a prison, that would never release him, but the impact of his downfall lived on. The Ross case had become a turning point, a moment when the country looked in the mirror and chose, if only for a time, to confront what it saw. And though history would continue to grapple with the same issues of race, power, and accountability, the story of one racist cop sentenced to life for pointing a gun at a general during a funeral stood as a reminder: even the untouchable can fall, even the shielded can face justice, and even in the darkest moments, a nation. Time has a way of softening even the hardest edges of memory, but some events etch themselves so deeply into a nation's consciousness that they never fade. The day a racist cop pointed a gun at a decorated general during a funeral was one such moment. Years later, people still remembered where they were when they saw the footage: the tense silence of the cathedral, the collective gasp as the weapon rose, the crackle of police radios, and the instant when calm resistance met violent hate. It was the kind of moment that history books condense into a single paragraph, but for those who lived through it, the memory stayed as sharp as broken glass. General Marcus Whitaker's face, composed and steady as the barrel hovered before him, became an enduring image of grace under fire. Photographs from that second were framed in military halls, used in lectures on leadership, and studied by cadets who wanted to understand what true courage looked like. For Whitaker himself, the moment was not about personal glory. He insisted, again and again, that he had simply been doing what any leader was trained to do: remain calm so others could follow. But the public saw more. They saw a man who stood tall against the embodiment of centuries of prejudice, who refused to flinch when hate tried to silence him. The irony was not lost on the nation. A soldier who had defended his country abroad was forced to defend his dignity at home, not on a battlefield but in a church pew. That contrast lingered. It raised uncomfortable questions about what it meant to serve a country that could still harbor such venom in its institutions. And yet, Whitaker's refusal to bow, his insistence on dignity, even as danger loomed, offered a kind of answer. The fight for justice was not finished, but it was worth enduring. The legacy of General Ellison, whose funeral had been disrupted by the act, was also reshaped. Before that day, he was remembered primarily as a brilliant strategist, a decorated commander, and a quiet man of principle. Afterward, his legacy became intertwined with the story of resilience. People spoke of how his final ceremony, nearly stolen by hatred, had instead sparked a national awakening. His name was mentioned not only in military histories, but in conversations about justice and equality. What might have been a private farewell to a great leader became a public reminder that the work of defending freedom does not end with battles overseas. It continues in the hearts of citizens at home. As years passed, documentaries revisited the case. College courses dissected the trial transcripts, analyzing how law and justice collided in such an unprecedented way. Activists pointed to the sentencing as a rare moment when accountability had reached the highest possible level. Skeptics, too, weighed in, questioning whether Ross's punishment was an outlier rather than a sign of lasting change. The debate never truly ended, but perhaps that was the point. The case forced the country to keep asking questions it could not afford to ignore. For Whitaker personally, life moved forward, but never entirely away from that day. He continued to serve with distinction, eventually retiring with honors. In interviews, when asked how the incident had shaped him, he never indulged in bitterness. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, the responsibility of leaders to remain steady under pressure, the responsibility of citizens to demand better from their institutions, and the responsibility of a nation to confront its flaws with honesty. His voice carried the weight of someone who had looked hate in the eyes and refused to surrender to it. Ross, meanwhile, became a footnote. His name faded into obscurity, spoken only when people needed an example of how arrogance and prejudice could destroy a life. The man who once strutted with a badge was reduced to silence behind bars, his story stripped of sympathy, his reputation beyond repair. The very system he thought would shield him had ultimately delivered his downfall. His life sentence became a symbol not of vengeance, but of consequence, the unyielding truth that choices once made cannot be undone. And so, the story of the racist cop and the military general became more than a headline. It became a parable for a country wrestling with its identity. It reminded people that justice, though often delayed, can still prevail. It reminded them that hate, no matter how brazen, can be confronted. It reminded them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate action. At anniversaries, when the cathedral bells tolled in honor of General Ellison, the memory of that day returned. Crowds gathered not to relive the chaos, but to celebrate the resilience that followed. Candles flickered, hymns rose, and people spoke quietly of how far the country had come, and how far it still needed to go. The image of Whitaker standing tall remained a beacon, a reminder that even in moments of darkness, dignity can shine like light through stained glass. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all was this: no individual, no matter how powerful or protected, is above accountability. Ross had believed otherwise, and it cost him everything. His downfall became proof that the law, when pressed by the collective demand of the people, could still reach even the untouchable. That knowledge gave strength to communities who had long been told their voices were too small, their stories too easily dismissed. And so the chapter closed, not with the roar of hatred, but with the quiet strength of justice fulfilled. A nation scarred by division found in one unforgettable moment both a warning and a promise. The warning that hate left unchecked can erupt anywhere, even in the holiest of places. The promise that courage and persistence can turn even the darkest acts into catalysts for change. In the end, it was not the gun, nor the rage behind it, that defined the story. It was the calm of a man who refused to bow. It was the judgment of a court that chose accountability over excuses. It was the voice of a nation that, for once, refused to look away. And as history moved forward, the story remained etched like a scar and a lesson. That justice may bend, it may falter. Decades passed, and what had once been front-page news gradually shifted into the fabric of history. Children born after that day grew up hearing the story, not as a headline but as a lesson. Teachers explained it in classrooms when discussing justice, equality, and the weight of personal responsibility. Professors dissected it in law schools as an example of how precedent can reshape accountability. In military academies, cadets studied the footage of General Whitaker's steady composure, learning that courage is not only found in combat, but in the quiet moments when everything is at stake. The cathedral itself became more than a place of worship, it became a landmark of resilience. Tourists visited not just for its architecture but to stand in the very aisle where history had pivoted. A small plaque was installed near the pews, not mentioning Ross by name, but commemorating the dignity and strength that prevailed in the face of hatred. Visitors often paused there, some bowing their heads, others whispering explanations to their children. It became a site of reflection, a reminder that justice is fragile and must always be guarded. General Marcus Whitaker, long retired, lived to see the full arc of his story unfold. In his later years, he became almost reluctant to discuss that day, not because he wanted to forget, but because he wanted the nation to move forward. Remember the lesson, he would say, but don't let one man's hate define us forever. Let our response define us. His humility made his legacy even greater. When he eventually passed away, his funeral was broadcast nationwide, his casket draped in the flag he had served so faithfully. Thousands attended, including young soldiers who had only ever known him as the man who stood tall in the cathedral. The president at the time delivered a eulogy, describing Whitaker as a symbol of courage, integrity, and the belief that dignity can triumph over hate. The world mourned not just a soldier, but a moral compass. As for David Ross, his death came quietly within prison walls. No reporters waited outside, no headlines marked the occasion. His life, once defined by a badge and authority, ended in silence. His name surfaced only in footnotes, in documentaries, or in conversations about how hate corrodes the soul. Some extremists tried to paint him as a victim of an unjust system, but their voices were small and drowned by the overwhelming truth. Ross was not remembered for his service, but for his betrayal of it. His grave bore no special markings, no honors. He was simply another man whose choices had written his legacy in shame. But perhaps the most powerful part of the story was not the lives of the two men at its center, but the ripples it left behind. Communities across the nation, scarred by histories of injustice, used the Ross case as a rallying point for reform. Young activists carried signs that read, "Justice is possible, demand it." Police academies added new courses on ethics and accountability, using Ross as the prime example of what happens when hate festers unchecked. Politicians debated reforms with renewed urgency, citing the case as proof that the public would no longer accept excuses. And in living rooms, families continued to pass the story down. Parents told their children, "This is what happens when someone abuses their power, and this is what happens when people stand together to demand justice." Those conversations became part of the nation's inheritance, a way of ensuring the mistakes of the past would not be forgotten. Even international observers remembered. Foreign news outlets had covered the story when it first broke, shocked that such an event could happen in a country that often called itself a beacon of freedom. Years later, scholars abroad pointed to the case as a turning point, proof that America could, when pushed, confront its own demons. It became not just a national lesson, but a global one. Accountability is universal, and no badge, no title, no uniform should ever place someone above the law. The cultural echoes appeared in unexpected places too. Movies were made, some dramatized, some documentary style, exploring not just the act itself, but the broader themes of justice and resilience. Plays were written for local theaters, telling the story through the eyes of bystanders in the cathedral, reminding audiences of how ordinary people witnessed history. Songs, poems, and murals across the nation continued to draw from the imagery of Whitaker standing tall. The story became art, and through art, it endured. What remained, above all, was a sense of accountability. The Ross case did not fix everything. Injustice still existed. Discrimination still reared its head. Power was still abused. But it proved, beyond a doubt, that accountability was possible, even for those once believed untouchable. That knowledge changed people. It gave them hope. It made them less willing to accept silence. It became a seed planted in the national conscience, one that continued to grow, generation after generation. And so, in the long view of history, the story of a racist cop sentenced to life for pointing a gun at a general during a funeral was not just about one moment of violence or one man's hatred. It was about a country learning, in a painful but undeniable way, that justice is not a gift handed down by the powerful, but a right claimed by the people. It was about the truth that dignity can stand taller than rage, that calm can defeat chaos, and that hate, no matter how loud, cannot erase courage. In the end, this story became less about Ross and Whitaker, and more about us, about who we choose to be when faced with darkness. It asked every generation the same question. When justice is tested, will we look away, or will we rise? And perhaps that is why, even long after the final gavel, the final salute, and the final breath, the story still lived. Because it was not just a chapter in history. It was a mirror, one that still reflects who we are.